I think we should get started now. Hello and welcome everyone for another exciting webinar from the Canada-India Research Center for Learning and Engagement. I'm Sharada Srinivasan. I'm in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph, and I'm the director of Circle. Circle, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, is a center that's been recently launched at the University of Guelph. It was launched in February 2020, this year. The intention is to be an interdisciplinary nucleus for cutting edge research related to India and the diaspora here in Canada. So this is our ninth webinar. So we did a couple over summer, and this is the third webinar for the fall term. Another exciting webinar, obviously. We have a very exciting theme. So the speaker, Dr. Sanjay Ruparelia, is Associate Professor of Politics and the Jarislowsky Democracy Chair at Ryerson University. He has done extensive research on India and China, but has also compared the two leaders, the current leaders of the two countries. And that is going to be the focus of his talk. Before I hand over to Sanjay, I just wanted to give a sort of a brief introduction, a seriously brief introduction to Sanjay's work. Sanjay's research addresses the politics of democracy, equality, and development broadly in the post-colonial world, but specifically also in India, South Asia, and China. And he's also interested in looking at the role of parties, movements, and institutions in politics. Some of his collected works include Divided We Govern, Coalition Politics in Modern India, and he is the editor of the Indian Ideology, 3 Responses to Perry Anderson, and he's one of the co-editors of Understanding India's New Political Economy, A Great Transformation with a question mark. The other editors are Sanjay Reddy, John Harris, and Stuart Coppridge. I think that Sanjay, I think John Harris is in the audience, in the virtual audience somewhere. So prior to joining Ryerson, Sanjay was Associate Professor of Politics at the New School for Social Research, and he was also the Assistant Director of the South Asia Institute at Columbia University. So welcome, Sanjay. Before I hand over to Sanjay, just a few etiquette information. Please turn off your videos and audio. So please mute yourself. And for during question time, you could either put your questions down in the chat, or you could actually talk. You could indicate in the chat that you would like to actually ask the question orally, in which case I would invite you to unmute yourself and pose your question to Sanjay. So with that, I hand over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you so much, Sharada, and thanks to everyone joining this morning. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. Let me see if I can start this PowerPoint. So I'll be making a PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully that's clear to everyone. So the title of this talk, A New India, A New China, the politics of Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping, is taken very much from these two leaders' own pronouncements on what they see themselves as doing since taking the helm in Asia's two giants. And just to set the frame of the comparison, I think this may help to explain the purpose of this presentation, is to look at these remarkable similarities in the way in which these two leaders have restructured and exercised power since they've taken office. And I think the best way, or at least perhaps a common way of thinking about this, is to think that India and China have, since independence and since the revolution, represented two models of political modernity in Asia and in the global South more generally. India, of course, as we know, as a modern constitutional democracy with a federal parliamentary system of government based on universal adult suffrage. That was its revolution in 1947. Has held 17 general elections and dozens of state elections since then, and has seen rising political and electoral participation over time, particularly among subaltern classes, women, and other historically marginalized groups. The Constitution of India also, as we know, famously separates powers and has many checks and balances within the regime. And its Supreme Court is often described as the most powerful court in the world in terms of its jurisdiction, its remit. So that's sort of the most unusual, unlikely democracy in the modern world, many would say. The People's Republic of China, in contrast, as we know, is a communist party state in which a hegemonic party monopolizes all formal power based on the principle of democratic centralism. The Chinese regime has a constitution, has had several. The most recent was the 1982 constitution. But, and although formally the National People's Congress has power to review, interpret, and revise that constitution, it never has. In addition, the constitution has no independent mechanism for reviewing violations of rights that it enumerates. And there's no process for reviewing lower court documents. The Supreme Court of China itself has historically never even exercised its powers to do so. So this is a very different regime, as we know. And those two images I could have mentioned, the first one of voters queuing for an election, a very emblematic one of an Indian election. And here, as the last regime we saw of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabo, of the men in the standing committee of the Politburo, who really run China. So that's the context we're trying to look at this particular set of leaders, Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping. The context in which they came to power is quite striking. Both took the helm between 2012 and 2014, following decades of rapid economic growth, which led to rising social inequalities and the expansion of new welfare schemes. Both of them came to power when there was systematic political corruption that had become embedded in the political system, environmental degradation, and economic slowdown. Their biographies in some ways couldn't be more different. Narendra Modi was, in his own description, a chaiwala from a plebeian backward caste who rose through power in the RSS and the BJP and really wrested control of the party between 2012 and 2014. Xi Jinping, in contrast, was literally a princeling, the son of a very famous revolutionary leader who fought alongside Mao, had been rehabilitated by Deng Xiaoping after the Cultural Revolution, and in fact was one of the architects of what happened in the Pearl River Delta and Shenzhen in the massive economic miracle that we've seen in China in terms of its manufacturing powerhouse that's been developed. So these biographies are very different, as I've just mentioned. But what's very striking, at least from what I've studied, is the remarkable convergence in their aims, in their strategies of power, and how they sought to exercise and practice it. And that's going to be the focus of what I'll be saying now over the next 20 minutes. So things began, you might say, normally in China. Xi Jinping was anointed the president. The premier was Li Keqiang. And in 2012, on the 30th anniversary of the 1982 Constitution, Xi Jinping and the Politburo generally made a declaration that the party, and I'll be reading here, must firmly establish throughout society the authority of the Constitution and the laws. The third plenum in 2013 further stated that they were going to build a rule of law country and safeguard the authority of the Constitution and the laws. So it began on a note where many liberals believed that this would be a moment for the constitutionalism to strengthen in China after regression had happened under Hu Jintao's regime. Xi Jinping also indicated or sent signals early on that the market should play a decisive role. He himself had earned his spurs in two provinces, in Fujian and Zhejiang, which was very famous bastions of private enterprise in China's capitalist, state capitalist juggernaut. And as I mentioned, his father himself played a key role in the agricultural reforms that happened in the early 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. The third pledge was this famous one to catch tigers as well as flies. And this was really a crackdown, a massive systemic crackdown on corruption in China. So what happened? Well, although Xi Jinping in the Politburo, when he was anointed, talked about the rule of law and constitutionalism, it was also the case, as it's often been in China, that the other side was also stated, namely in 2014 in a communique of the plenum, that the rule of law and party leadership are identical and inseparable. Calls for a greater constitutionalism by prominent legal scholars and liberal rights activists were suppressed and censored in that period. And then most famously, or not most famously, but famously for many of us, particularly university professors, was the so-called 7 don't mentions. This was a directive of the Central Committee, which prohibited professors from discussing, and I quote, universal values, freedom of the press, civil society, civic rights, historical mistakes committed by the Communist Party, elite cronyism, and an independent judiciary. Just in passing, this is when I began to study these things, so it was not a particularly opportune moment to be studying them. So what we began to see very quickly with Xi Jinping was, as I've described it, rule of law or rule by law, as many observers of China describe it, without constitutionalism, or at least the fact that Chinese constitutionalism is the double-edged sword. And Xi quickly consolidated power. The 19-party Congress introduced a new Politburo Standing Committee, which had many of his loyalists. There was a new party edict, and the party edict was very important, that the government, the military, society, and the schools, north, south, east, and west, the party leads them all. And therefore, we saw a reintroduction of party cells and many private enterprises and government ministries, or at least a more visible, explicit role. Xi himself was designated the core leader and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, a title not used since 1954. And this image on the right of the screen, which you may be puzzled by, is someone's attempt to describe what was called Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. It was enshrined in the party charter, ideologically equal to Mao Zedong thought and Deng Xiaoping theory. So this tells you how important Xi was in the party. He was suddenly alongside Deng and Mao, and this was at the start of his rule. And very quickly, observers, commentators, scholars of China began to discuss the fact that, are we seeing a new Mao in China? Many of the normal conventions were broken. The convention that presidents of China should only serve for 10 years was annulled by a constitutional amendment in 2018. Li Keqiang, who was the premier, was very quickly sidelined by Xi Jinping by the establishment of what are called party leading groups, particularly on the economy. Premiers historically in post-Deng China were responsible for the economy. And the attack on corruption in China was largely done, of course, without judicial oversight of any kind, through something called the Discipline Inspection Commission, which was also run by a very close confidant of Xi Jinping, Wang Qishan, who very quickly expanded the series of investigations to ensnare over 2.5 million officials. 1.5 million of them were punished in some way in the party, including very high-ranking former members of the Politburo, over 24 high-ranking generals, and including some figures that were seen as the sort of anointed successors to Xi Jinping. What was very striking is that nobody was anointed as successor to Xi Jinping. It's the first time that this has happened since Deng Xiaoping ruled the party from behind, so to speak, in the early 1980s. And so what we see here is a massive expansion of Xi Jinping's power and a concentration and a personalization of that authority in his own person. Um, the rise of Modi, in contrast, at the start, you might say it couldn't have been more different, as I've already explained through their biographies. Modi stormed to power in the BJP by wresting authority, sidelining ruthlessly many rivals and party elders in the campaign for the 2014 election. He, as many scholars and observers of India know, and many of us would know here, very famously in that campaign, championed his strength, and trumpeted his 56-inch chest, said that he would battle cross-border Pakistani aggression, and declared himself Vikas Purush, the development man from Gujarat, who would bring industrialization and millions of good jobs as India modernized its economy. The 2014 election set some historic precedents. The BJP became the first party since 1984 to win a parliamentary majority on its own. It became the first party the only party besides the Congress to win a majority on its own, since the Janata Party in 1977 at the end of the day was an agglomeration of various other parties. And when Modi first came to power, he very much sort of championed this sort of new nationalism combined with a sort of agenda for modernization. And this is just a depiction from one of his rallies. But we also in India quickly saw what we have been seeing in China, a concentration and personalization of power in the Prime Minister's office and in the figure of Modi himself, the most presidential Prime Minister India has seen since Indira Gandhi. In some ways, you might say more. Cabinet has become a rubber stamp institution under Narendra Modi, and even more so since he was re-elected in 2019. He rarely submits to questioning in Parliament. And despite the fact that India has constitutionally a separation of powers and many checks and balances, we've seen a weakening of them dramatically over the last 6 years. The institution that most people focused on, of course, was the Supreme Court, the major counter-majoritarian institution in India. And early on, it rebuffed attempts by the government, the executive, to interfere in its workings in terms, obviously, of overlooking and enforcing the rule of law. The National Judicial Appointments Commission was struck down as unconstitutional in 2015. And there have been some important landmark judgments by the Supreme Court. For instance, the famous privacy judgment, that privacy was a fundamental right in 2017. But the larger picture that we have seen is of a court very quickly losing its power and its authority, not least because of some of its own actions. There have been behind the scenes interference in the appointment of, let me rephrase that. There's been some behind the scenes interference in the scuttling of judicial nominees who are seen to be opposed to the BJP by the executive. Others have been shifted from different benches in the high courts. Most famously or infamously, there were allegations that the executive was interfering in how the benches were being constituted, and therefore the outcomes of controversial cases when the Chief Justice was Chief Justice Mishra, in this remarkable public denunciation that took place just a couple of years ago. And more generally, the court has been seen to abdicate many of its responsibilities. Very important controversial legislation, it's refused to judge, whether it's the Aadhaar bills, what has been happening in Kashmir with detention, violation of habeas corpus, and so on. And so what we've really seen is a concentration of executive power at the expense of the legislature and the judiciary. And this has taken place because of a new party movement structure in India. The BJP has expanded rapidly in terms of the size of the party. Take this, of course, with a grain of salt, but reports of 100 million members of the party under the leadership of Amit Shah. That's a figure on the left, on the right of Modi, the left of our screen, who was his confidant and partner in Gujarat. And this party has, like many governments in India, tried to compromise the autonomy of institutions, whether they're universities, research institutes, cultural centers. But I think many would agree in a much more vociferous, explicit manner to try to politicize and undermine the autonomy of many independent public institutions. Many of the institutions, rules, and bodies that were there to increase transparency in India have also been quickly undermined, from the right to information to the Whistleblowers Act, which was never properly implemented, to the Lokpal, which barely met. And this, of course, is ironic, you might say, when Narendra Modi himself rode a wave of anti-corruption protest following the India Against Corruption movement of Anna Hazare in 2012. The most distinctive feature about this new BJP, I think you could say, is its desire to colonize and occupy all political space, all institutional space in India. It's even declared that its campaign, and it's in a permanent electoral mode since they've come to power in 2014, is to remove opposition from India, a Vipaksh Mukt India. So these are the sort of general tendencies we've seen: the concentration of power in the executive and the expansion of the party within the state. What have been the results? In India and China, we've seen the targeting of civil society. In China, in 2013, there was a new ordinance which allowed community organizations to register themselves independently. But internal documents from the party had already declared that civil society may be a threat to the power of the party and its authority. In 2016, a new law on non-governmental organizations prohibited religious groups, required all projects receiving foreign support to be registered, and enabled certain associations to be deemed unwelcome, including the Ford Foundation and the Asia Society. And what we've seen is a particularly harsh crackdown on the rights lawyers, the Weichuan movement in China, since Xi Jinping came to power. Of course, this preceded his ascent to the office of the presidency. It began under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabo, but it's really deepened and accelerated. So lawyers and activists have been charged, detained, disappeared for picking quarrels and provoking troubles, disturbing social order, on the grounds that they were inciting subversion of state power. We've seen very similar developments in India. The implementation of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act in 2010, more vociferously by the BJP than had happened under the Congress-led UPA, targeting NGOs and activists who were deemed to be anti-development and therefore anti-national in their views. Since 2014, more stringent application and revision to the FCRA has led to the suspension or revocation of licenses of approximately 10,000 NGOs receiving funds from abroad, approximately 1/4 of the total in India. And it's the irony and contradictions of this are quite astounding, because this law was enforced more vociferously in the name of transparency and accountability. But the reason for decertification and the criteria for regaining it have never been made transparent themselves. Furthermore, parties have been exempt from the very same law. So parties have been receiving foreign funding, whereas NGOs have not. And finally, the Make in India campaign, as I'll mention in a moment, explicitly courts foreign capital. So clearly the foreign hand, so to speak, is seen as dangerous for some groups, but not for others. The wider attack on civil society in both countries has also led to further constraining of media autonomy. In China, of course, as we know, there's very limited press freedom, but it has actually grown worse under Xi Jinping. Journalists suspected, again, of these charges of picking quarrels and provoking troubles online could lose their press cards after 2016 and face criminal indictment. The media in 2016, the party said, must speak for the party's will and project the party's authority. An older regulation that made it illegal to hire reporters or publish content from anonymous sources, which is what outlets such as Tencent, Sina, and Caijing had done, were muzzled increasingly. So what we've seen is a clampdown even further on the media in China. In India, the media has also been under assault. And of course, in some cases, has also abdicated its own duties. The Modi government has disparaged the media, often as news traders, or even worse, as prostitutes, so to speak. There have been many behind-the-scenes interventions in removing editors, in censoring certain lines and of reporting and investigation. And this is particularly the case in the television media, which is really, I would say, degraded in many ways in India over these years. And what we've seen is a culture of intimidation and fear, a fear of reprisal and growing self-censorship in many parts of the media, as some very courageous journalists have pointed out. So notwithstanding very important outlets such as The Wire and Scroll, and of course some of the leading newspapers which continue to investigate and criticize the government, generally we've seen a real deterioration in press freedom in India. Another area where you see a commonality, and most of what I'll be talking about now as you can see in this presentation, are commonalities between the two countries, and we can focus on differences in our discussion, I hope, is the expansion of the state. Both these leaders came to power, and observers and supporters of them said that they would champion liberal reforms. They would liberalize the economy. But in fact, what we've seen is quite the opposite. In China, Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, supporting the line that markets would play a decisive role. And one of the great ambitions of China was the so-called Made in China campaign, to make China a global leader in 10 advanced industries in the 21st century, from robotics to artificial intelligence to pharmaceuticals and so on. But what we've seen under Xi Jinping, and you might say this was predictable given the campaign, was that the state has actually advanced at the expense of the private sector. State-owned enterprises have consolidated their power through preferential access to capital markets and to bank credit, even though the private sector employs the vast majority of workers in China. We've seen a decline in productivity in China. Credit fuel growth continues to expand and leading to greater indebtedness of households and companies in the Chinese economy. And this was before COVID, so we can talk about what happened afterwards. But what we've really seen is expansion of the state over the market and society. In India, Narendra Modi came to power championing this phrase, minimum government, maximum governance. Government has no business in business, he said. And like in China, some important campaigns were unveiled early on. The Make in India campaign, Smart Cities, Digital India. You might call these all modernization campaigns to leapfrog India's current state into a more advanced industrialized future. But what we've seen, of course, since Narendra Modi has come to power are shocks and distress and a decline in growth. The most important shock, of course, was demonetization, which has by and large, by almost every measure, been a grand failure in any of its stated aims, but has inflicted great pain on the economy and particularly those who are most insecure within it. We've seen growing agrarian distress, the much vaunted production of many millions of jobs for youth entering the economy has not taken place. And growth has actually continued to decline in India, particularly in the last 2 years, across sectors. And the public sector has actually become more important in propping up whatever growth there is. Public spending has expanded at the expense of private investment. And we've seen a lowering of consumption indices in a manner that we've not seen since the 1970s. And this increased expansion of the state has led to an expansion of what Foucault and others would have called governmentality in everyday social life. This is particularly in the area of social welfare in India and China. In China, we've seen the expansion of the social credit system, the basis of which is a mobile payments revolution. Mobile payments now in China are greater than many countries combined in terms of the level and volume of transactions that take place on a daily basis. It's very much allowed to happen, or not allowed to happen. It's very much promoted and encouraged and supported by what are called killer apps, these sort of integrated apps that allow you to do everything from your phone. The image on the top sort of shows this incredible infrastructure which connects individuals and enterprises across society in China. But what's very striking about the social credit system, of course, is that it is also aligned with mechanisms of surveillance, voice, facial, and gait recognition, which allow the government and companies to blacklist certain individuals if they are deemed to be not good citizens, so to speak. And generally what we've seen is a massive expansion of surveillance in China, CCTV cameras, smartphone apps, security officers, and also human informants. India has also seen an expansion of a similar type of, you call a social welfare architecture under the Modi government. The expansion of direct cash transfers and new insurance schemes at the expense of rights-based entitlements in India, which had been introduced by the UPA government in 2004. These two are linked to bank accounts and mobile payments through Aadhaar, the biometric ID system in India, which has expanded under the Modi government, despite serious concerns about privacy, data security, and serial misidentification, simply the reliability of the technology. And we've seen this expansion of surveillance in India as well, not to quite the same extent as in China, but that's not for a lack of trying, more a question of state capacity. And these images capture what is taking place. The phrase I've used here, seeing like a state, a 21st century state, for some of you who may know this famous book by Seeing Like a State. I'm sorry, I'm suddenly forgetting the famous anthropologist's name, James Scott, which talked about how states desire legibility and simplification of their societies in order to control them. So what we see in China and India today is you would call a turbocharged, more muscular version of this high modernist ideology with an expansion of state capacity in a way that no 19th century statesman could have possibly have imagined. And so these images from China and the one on India sort of capture what's happening with this expansion of the state, this expansion of surveillance throughout society. So let me end by saying one final feature which really does bind these two leaders in ways that, of course, that have troubled many of us. And that is in the face of nationalism, or on the foundation of nationalism. What kind of nationalist vision do they project? Xi Jinping, when he came to power, talked about a new China based on a Chinese dream. And this is a quote from him, that we must make persistent efforts, press ahead with indomitable will, continue to push forward the great cause of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and strive to achieve the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. On the face of it, nothing wrong given the inequalities and asymmetries in the international order, which has been dominated by the West for 2 centuries. And key to this Chinese dream, of course, were 2 100s, so to speak. The goal that China would become a moderately well-off society by 2020, that's this year, which was pushed off course by the coronavirus. And the goal of modernization, that China would be a fully developed nation by 2049. Because although China is, by different measures, the first or second largest economy in the world, it's still a middle-income country. But what has been the nature of this Chinese dream for those who are not part of the D majority? Well, we've seen the imposition of national unity and political sovereignty at home and abroad in China. Of course, it's happened in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan, or claims on Taiwan today. In Xinjiang, most disturbingly, the expansion of massive detention camps, the cultural and political repression of the Uyghur population, on grounds that they are a threat to the stability and security of China, and a massive expansion of the surveillance apparatus and a massive indoctrination campaign. This is one of the great human rights violations taking place in the world today. And we've seen it, of course, in Hong Kong, a clampdown on this vibrant, remarkable democracy movement or rights movement in Hong Kong through the imposition of a national security law, which has extraterritorial reach. So we've seen in China, this is the headlines of the news every day, an increasing desire to impose its will, to expand its claim of sovereignty at home and abroad in the South China Seas, and of course, even beyond. Even criticism of China in countries abroad is seen as an attack on their sovereignty. India has seen in its own way a similar majoritarian nationalist vision. The Modi government, when it came to power, has many different slogans. One that was repeated often was Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas. Together, all will develop with everyone's trust, sort of very loosely translated. But what have we seen since 2014? We've seen a clear project of defining citizenship in the nation as Hindu in India under a BJP government. This has taken place in numerous ways, but the main point I would probably want to stress, as many others have, is that citizenship increasingly in India has been defined by religion and is something to be proved. And therefore criticism of the BJP or any of its measures is seen and equated as treasonous. We've seen social campaigns such as Ghar Wapsi, Love Jihad, Gau Raksha, in which many acts of intimidation, harassment, and violence have taken place by Hindu nationalist vigilantes. This has happened before the Modi government have come to power, of course, but now many would agree that it's far worse because of impunity from above and what seems to be growing criminalization of sentiment in society, most viciously seen in lynchings that have taken place since 2014, in which the police often simply are bystanders or even abet the violence that is taking place in many states of India. We've seen legislative changes from the anti-cow slaughter legislation in many states to the annulment of Article 370 in Kashmir, which removed its special rights under the Constitution and led to a curfew and an imposition of the army since August of 2019. And most recently in the Citizenship Amendment Act, which granted the right to citizenship or a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants, illegal migrants from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, as long as they were not Muslim. And in doing so, violated the Constitution, the preamble, Article 14, the basic structure, which always separated citizenship from any religious identification or loyalty or belief in India. And that's a second measure, a second plank platform where you might see some of these changes. And the third has been actually in judicial rulings. As I've already mentioned earlier on, many had hoped that the judiciary might be a counter-majoritarian check on the executive. And the judiciary has, for the most part, despite some early rulings, an important one on triple talaq early on, has really abdicated its responsibility. We see this in Kashmir, where it's refused to take up cases on whether detentions were violating fundamental rights or habeas corpus. We've seen it in its judgments in Ayodhya, most famously, which granted the right to build a temple on the site of the raised Babri Masjid, despite the fact that the court called the destruction of the Babri Masjid, the mosque itself, an egregious violation of the rule of law. And this on the grounds that Hindus, as opposed to Muslims, could establish uninterrupted possession of the property itself, putting a burden of proof on Muslims yet again to claim, to show that they were proper citizens of India. So let me conclude then by saying sort of three broad features that I think really strikingly show convergence in the way in which power has been restructured and exercised in India since Modi and Xi Jinping have come to power. One is the personalization of power itself. It's not simply the concentration of power in the executive, but its personalization in these two individuals. The second is a remarkable expansion of the state apparatus over the private sector, over civil society, and of the party within it. Of course, we would expect this in China because it is a Communist Party state. But what's very striking in India is how the BJP itself has increasingly colonized many spaces. And we can talk about why it's been able to do that, of course, because there are many opposition parties, many elections that still take place, to see why it is that they've been thus far relatively ineffective in combating this. And the third is what I've sort of ended with here, what we might describe as an exclusionary majoritarian nationalism, which really has been at the expense of minority rights and the rule of law, in which both leaders have really tried to reshape the attitudes and boundaries of the nation. So let me just end there. I'm probably taking a little bit longer than I had hoped, but I really look forward to criticisms, comments, and questions that you may have.
Thank you, Sanjay. I don't know if you noticed, there are actually questions popping up in the chat already. So I'm going to just kind of post some of them to you. So one of the first questions is from Clara Joseph. I mean, asking you specifically to talk more broadly about structural and ideological issues as they pertain to democracy and modernity, but many of them might apply to the West as well, right? So, for example, the indigenous community in Canada might think that you're actually comparing Canada and the US, you know, I mean, so a lot of this could be used to compare, you know, issues around democracy and modernity for other nation states as well. So do you want to respond to that? And then I can share the next questions.
Sure. So yes, thank you for that question. I think many political scientists have been using this phrase or this concept of democratic backsliding, that we've seen a deterioration in the norms, institutions, and procedures of democracy around the world, whether that's in established democracies, newer democracies, or authoritarian regimes, which may have had certain practices we would associate with democratic governance. So I think that's a broad trend, and the question is absolutely right that this is not unique to India and China. So that would be sort of the first response. The second would be, so then why focus on India and China apart from simply my interest in it or maybe the interests of others? And here I think what I would say certainly about India is that the decline in India, I think, has been quite striking. If you look at lots of measures of the state and quality of democracy in the world, take those with a pinch of salt. But these are sort of indices like Freedom House, the varieties of democracy, the VDEM index out of Sweden, the Polity 4 score of the World Bank, for instance. And if you look at a lot of comparative scholars of democracy, in 2014, they said, you know, despite this erosion that we see in many parts of the world, India seems to be holding up quite well. And what is so striking is that since 2014, all of these indices show a dramatic decline in India compared to other countries. You know, so the United States, of course, is one that that worries so many of us 6 days from the election now. Its decline has been dramatic. But I would say what's happening in India in many ways has been worse. There's still been a lot of opposition in the United States, its institutions, the autonomy of its institutions, the criticism or the freedom of its press in a way which I just don't think we see in India today. So I think we do need to think about these comparisons, and not to make invidious comparisons about, you know, who's better and who's worse, but simply to say, where have things regressed or progressed, and at what rate and why? And I think what's happened in India has, the decline's been quite striking in a way which only reminds people of the 1970s, and we can think about comparisons and contrasts to the 1970s. And in China, I think, what can you say about China? I think if you're concerned about democracy in the world, and obviously you have to be concerned about China simply because it's the second most powerful country in the world. And with the United States, it will define the 21st century. So what's happening within China and how China is acting abroad and how we interpret that, there's a real debate on how people see that, is a really important debate and discussion to have. On the one hand, there's a resurrection of sort of a cold warrior mentality in the West, which I don't think is very helpful or constructive or even accurate about what's happening in China to some extent. But on the other hand, you know, there are really very disturbing developments that have happened in China, most prominently in Xinjiang. Tibet is an old issue. It's increasing assertion of power or claims on Taiwan and Hong Kong. So it's obviously a front line of any sort of struggle for democracy in the world. And I think, so it was in that sense that I think we should really be paying attention to these two countries, because for better or worse, simply by their weight and their importance and the importance of the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific region in the 21st century, we need to pay particular attention to what's happening there. I'm not sure that's a good answer to the question, But I very much agree with the general spirit that what we're seeing is an erosion on many fronts in many democracies, and particularly I would say in the West, which has collapsed that old distinction between the old established consolidated democracies of the West, which seem to be immune from so many of these problems, so to speak, of populism and sort of neo-fascist tendencies and so on, from what was happening in the South. So it's very much a global phenomenon.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay. So here's a question related to Tibet. So I think there are two parts to the question. First is what happens to Tibet after the Dalai Lama's time is up? And how do you see that playing into Indo-Sino relations?
So
thanks, Andy, for the question.
Yes. So I don't know what to say to the first question because I don't have the information or expertise to consider what happens. I think many, simply as a general observer, I think what happens after the Dalai Lama is no longer here with us on the scene is an open question. I imagine there may be some in our audience who may be more informed than I to sort of feel that question. On the question, sorry, can you say the second part of the question, which is what impact it has on Sino-Indo relations?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Well, I think the question of Tibet seems to be one issue amongst many others that have seen growing tensions between India and China over the last 5-6 years. I mean, of course, at the moment, what everyone is focused on is what's happened in Ladakh, which is a very serious escalation of tension and conflict on the border, and I think that took many people by surprise. And we can talk about why that actually took place. One of the issues I think it's worth discussing, certainly with amongst ourselves, is to what extent what was driving the Chinese to assert themselves, across the line of actual control. From what we've been reading in different reports, on the one hand, I think it was quite surprising, given that China was increasingly in confrontation with many states on many issues from the South and East China Seas, the trade disputes, and larger geopolitical disputes with the United States, growing tensions with the European Union, and so on, growing criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, Central Asia less so. So the timing of it was quite striking, that here was China sort of increasingly battling many critics and potentially adversaries on multiple fronts. But one of the things that I don't know how to think about clearly enough is to what extent the decision to annul Article 370 in Kashmir by the Modi government precipitated China's actions to assert its sovereignty, or its claim to sovereignty, along the line of actual control, which of course, as we know, has been disputed for a long time, and has not been clearly demarcated. And so I think Tibet is simply one of these issues that has led to growing tension between India and China. I don't know whether it doesn't seem at the moment that is the issue that's going to lead to the danger of an actual outbreak of a military conflict. But there are others who would be much better informed than I would on this issue. I haven't studied this carefully myself. Okay.
Two questions related to foreign policy. Gopika Solanki poses a question of the impact of their respective foreign policies, especially on Asia. So that's the first question. The second question is from Steffi Haman. The broader perspective or perception is of China as a threat. So when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative and so on and so forth, on the world stage, China is seen as a threat. What is the general perception within India of China? Are people seeing this as a threat, or is the public seeing it as something good? So your thoughts on these two questions.
These are all very big, tough questions. Foreign policy on India, how the view, let me rephrase the first one. How has Indian and Chinese foreign policy changed, if it's changed at all, with respect to Asia? Well, I think there are a couple of things that seem to be quite important. On the one hand, of course, I think the clear story of China since Xi Jinping took power, and that there's a debate amongst China scholars on whether it has to do with his personality, his politics, his ideology in particular, or whether it's simply a structural feature of Chinese foreign policy that was bound to express itself, is simply the fact that China, of course, sees it as its right to become the dominant power in the Asia Pacific. Hence its clashes with the United States. And its clashes with many countries over disputed sort of territories within the South and East China Sea. It doesn't see why the United States should be the dominant power in Asia Pacific. And therefore also its assertions, its longstanding claims on Taiwan as being a renegade province that it wants to reintegrate. I think the more open and fascinating question is, what will India do? We know that historically, and even since the US-India Civil Nuclear Accord, that on the one hand, India has grown over the last two and a half decades closer to the United States in terms of its military and strategic partnerships and alliance and defense. But it's never to date wanted to be an actual junior partner in the way in which Japan or South Korea have aligned with the United States in some kind of defense pact. And I think that's why the confrontation in Ladakh recently is generated so much scrutiny and debate and attention, because I think many scholars are asking, many commentators, is this a tipping point where India historically has tried to maintain its strategic autonomy vis-a-vis all other great powers. So it wants to maintain relations with Iran in order to import gas, despite the US saying it shouldn't. At the beginning of the term of Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping, Modi was very openly courting Chinese investment in infrastructure in India, and of course also Japanese investment. And so this general position of enhancing its strategic autonomy, I think, has been a long-standing feature of Indian foreign policy. And the question I think we all have to think through is, and watch is the recent escalation of tension between India and China so great that it actually pushes India towards a more formal pact, or further down the road where it's not trying to balance its relations with the United States and Russia. Of course, India remains very dependent on Russian military hardware and its importation of those types of goods. And so this sort of balancing act that India has assiduously played for a very long time, is that going to become imbalanced and tilted more towards the United States, towards the so-called Quad with Japan, South Korea, and Australia vis-a-vis China? I think that's a big open question. But what we do see is a shift, I think, certainly in the tenor and the rhetoric coming out of New Delhi. And I think the question about perceptions of China and India, India, of course, right from the beginning was very skeptical and critical of Belt and Road. It saw Belt and Road as a way of encircling India. And Chinese assertion in the Indian Ocean, of course, we know about in Pakistan and Sri Lanka with the ports and the economic corridor. India was very critical from the beginning on those measures. I think what I've seen, again, it's just surveys that have been reported and published in India, that like in many countries, like in Canada, there's been a very marked deterioration in perceptions of China. And we see that in the EU, we see that in the United States, we see that in Canada, and we see it in India as well. So I think for China and for the rulers in Beijing, that's a real problem, isn't it? Because I think China and India, Brazil, the so-called basic countries and others, there were very legitimate criticisms of the so-called rules-based international order post-2000, about the dominance of the West, about the asymmetries of power in terms of who ran the World Bank and the IMF and the UN and so on. But China's actions in recent years are actually obscuring some of these deeper structural inequalities. And so in that sense, it seems to be an act of self-harm, the way the Chinese are acting. And I think China scholars themselves are continuing to debate about what's causing this. Is it something that was bound to happen? As Deng Xiaoping said, China should bide its time until it's powerful enough to assert itself. So it was bound to happen, and China now is so powerful, and the United States is in a crisis often of its own making, whether it was the war in Iraq and afterwards, and then of course the election of Trump and what has happened. Or is it the case that Xi Jinping himself, that this particular leader in his ideology, in the outlook of those who support him in the Politburo and the party more widely, is what's the cause of China's actions, and that these actions are actually going to harm its potential to find allies and supporters going forward.
Okay, so from foreign policy, we move to the economic realm. Question from Ramchandra Guha. Xi's personalization and centralization have not impeded economic growth, but Modi's has. Why is this so? And the second, okay, maybe I'll just wait for you to respond to this and then give you the second question.
So the question is, if I understood correctly, centralization and personalization power itself is not in itself a hindrance to economic growth, but why has it happened under Modi? Yes?
Yeah.
I would think so.
There's been a precipitous decline in the Indian economy since Modi came.
Yes. Thank you, Ram. I imagine there are two parts to an answer. One is that I'm not defending the government, but there is something to be said for, well, they inherited certain problems. Certainly, we know, for instance, the bad loans in the banking system, which had not been cleared up by the UPA. The UPA had to increase investment in social infrastructure in very important ways, but there was still a lot of work to be done and so on. So these are just some of the measures. So they inherited something, and that's what the government's defense would be. But of course, I think that what's so striking about the Modi government, 2014 and since, is that it just doesn't really have it doesn't have a prospectus to really address the problems of the Indian economy. It's so striking that its signature moves, when we talk about its first term, we talk about demonetization, which was a fiasco on almost every level. The goods and services tax, which the UPA had tried to introduce and implement, the Modi government finally pushed through, but they bungled its implementation. And I think in some ways, some of the earliest critics and skeptics of the Modi government as being a panacea for India's structural economic problems, great debates on what those are. I think of the work of Pranab Bardhan, for instance, 2012, 13, 14, and others who had studied Gujarat and said, the so-called vaunted Gujarat model, is that a model for India? First of all, was it generating all these jobs that had to be created in India? It wasn't. It was very much defined by heavy industry and petrochemicals and so on. And its social development indicators were always middling. Jean Andres's work showed that. Almost on every measure, it was a middling performer, and compared to other states of equal wealth, such as Tamil Nadu and even others. It was actually quite a lackluster performer. And so I think of course, because I suppose I would maybe put it this way, that centralization of power is not an obstacle to rapid economic growth. If you think of the developmental states in East Asia, of course, as we know, one of the defining features was this concentration of power and linkages between the executive, the bureaucracy, and business groups. But that required a certain strategic vision and a plan and a certain discipline to sort of implement. And I think you just don't see with this government, you don't see a consistent, coherent plan. And I think the concentration of power in the Prime Minister's office and the silencing of criticism or dissent itself means that many half-baked ideas or just bad initiatives, are allowed to happen. I mean, demonetization is one we keep returning to. It's not the cause of all of the problems we see, but the fact that it even took place unknown to some of the key, ministers in the government or advisors to do with economic affairs itself is very striking. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer to Ram's question, but I think there's just a lack of understanding of what's necessary to address the various challenges that the Indian economy faces in this particular government, in this particular Prime Minister's office.
Okay, I'm now going to invite Leonard Buckles to pose her question, and that's again related to the economics.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I had recently took part in a webinar from the London School of Economics where Dr. Jayati Ghosh had done a presentation on pandemic in India and the Modi response to the pandemic. And from my understanding of her lecture, it seemed that the government was not performing very well in terms of providing a social safety net to the Indian population. And she had mentioned about the Prime Minister's special fund, the JDY fund. And she had mentioned that might even be less than 10% of the population that could even benefit from that. And you did mention that in your presentation. So I just wanted to get your understanding in terms of what you see potentially as the Modi government's broader sort of populist approach to governance, and really how broad is that reach?
Thank you for that question. That's a complicated question. So I think when you think of the Modi government's sort of social welfare initiatives post 2014, I think there's sort of two striking features. One is an emphasis, as I mentioned, on cash transfers, market-oriented instruments, new insurance schemes to provide social protection to India's population at the expense of rights-based entitlements that the UPA had introduced. So, there's been a very concerted assault on the right to information, disparagement of NREGA, which they had to rehabilitate around 2018 because of the agrarian crisis that had taken place, so declining investment in the rural sector, and all kinds of other problems that it causes deepening agrarian distress that many have studied, including John Harris, who's with us today, and others. So the one hand is a sort of very market-oriented approach to social protection. And you see it actually in the health sector most vividly. The expansion of health insurance. Well, I'm not sure what Professor Ghosh said, but knowing her work, I imagine what she must have emphasized and what others have emphasized is that, what we see in India has one of the most privatized healthcare systems in the world. Out-of-pocket expenses are over 70%. It's like the United States, or worse actually. And under the UPA, there was a concerted attempt to start to build that critical public health infrastructure, particularly in rural India, the National Rural Health Mission. And they made some important strides with, of course, lots of setbacks along the way. But after the Modi government came in, it just doubled down on this sort of more insurance-based approach. And that approach means that you're not building up the public health sector's capacity. Nurses, doctors, the primary health center level, the community health clinics, and so on. A figure that I remember from about 2 or 3 years ago is something like only 20% of public health centers, that's the main point of contact for most Indian citizens, particularly in rural India, met Indian public health standards, in terms of having running water, electricity, a nurse on staff, vaccination kits, and so on. And so there's a real crisis in the Indian public health sector. One, I don't think, certainly I think people who study public health in that field have studied it for a long time, but political scientists and sociologists have actually neglected it. And if there's one area of state capacity which is really shockingly poor in India, it's actually the health sector. I think we've done more studies of education than health. And of course, in a pandemic, as you said, it's brutally exposed. So this sort of more market-oriented approach to social protection is not a panacea of any type. India underspends in public investment, as a percentage of GDP, far below even its comparators in other parts of the South and the post-colonial world. On the other hand, what was very striking in the run-up to the 2019 election is as growth was faltering, so poorly that the jobs reports from the labor ministry were no longer issued because it showed that unemployment and underemployment was rising in India under the Modi government. We've seen all kinds of disputes and about the methodology of how you measure growth in India, the revision of growth, of the growth figures themselves. What was very striking in that run-up is that this populism was of a type that the Modi government themselves decried in 2014 as SOPs, right? That were entitlements as opposed to measures of empowerment, as one of the economic advisors to the Modi government early on, Arvind Panagari, had described. And what we saw in 2019 was this government doing exactly what it had criticized previous governments for doing, farm loan waivers, reservations for upper caste groups, because there were no jobs being created in the private sector as had been promised, and so on. And those populist schemes were very important, many electoral analysts said, in helping the Modi government get reelected in 2019. Cooking oil and cylinders that were directed to poorer households, the building of toilets in a lot of rural India under the Swachh Bharat campaign, and all targeted and identified as being the sort of the gift of the prime minister and the party himself. So I think what we see in under this government is sort of these two faces. One's a sort of very neoliberal market-oriented approach to social protection, which has made many matters worse, because what we do need is greater public investment. We need stronger public institutions, of stronger public infrastructure, and in health, education, and other areas. And then on the other hand, these sort of more, sort of what the economists, when they use the language of populism, what they mean is sort of populist gambits. And they've been important. I don't want to diminish them or belittle them. I mean, these are important goods. But I suppose, I've been trying to find a way to answer your question well. I think this way maybe I would summarize it. What we see in the Modi government, I think, generally speaking, is the sort of private supply of public goods. And we see the sort of public supply of private goods. Others have used this formulation as well. And what many development economists, right, students of development might actually argue for is a sort of reversal, that these classic public goods of health and education and so on should be ones where the public sector leads. And the provision of these other goods, which are sort of household private entitlements, might be ones which you would hope the public sector may not actually have to take the lead on, because people actually have good jobs and incomes are rising and they're able to meet those needs themselves.
Thank you. So that leaves us with about 2 minutes, and we haven't still talked about the opposition at all. And I keep so as a chair, I'm going to pose a question to you. So in the Chinese context, the structure doesn't allow for the opposition, and people like Amartya Sen have talked about the importance of the opposition in the democratic setup, right? Now, in India, one might say, and this is where I would like to hear your thoughts, I mean, to what extent has Modi's rise been facilitated by the lack of a credible opposition?
Yes.
Very quickly.
Yeah. Well, that is the question. Where is the opposition? And I think it has obviously been severely demoralized by these incredible victories of the Modi government. And I think, it's been a lack of leadership by many parts. I mean, there have been so many problems that this government has either failed to confront or has actually created. There's been pockets of resistance all across the country. But what you need is these movements and these of citizens, whether it's the farmers' movement of Western India, students uprising. Where are the parties able to mobilize and consolidate and harness this energy and this opposition? Whether it's the Congress Party, the old Janta Parivar, which of course was splintered, and we're seeing it in Bihar now. Let's see what happens in this election. I think what lessons the oppositions need to think about is what the BJP has done. I think it's on sort of two levels. One is actually creating parties as organizations. The BJP has always, like historically the left had had a cadre-based party. The left, of course, has been in terminal decline for a long time. When I said the left, I mean the communist left. So really investing in parties as organizations that mobilize, members, supporters, the electorate. And then I think to think about the other battle where they've really failed is the ideological one, which is I think it's a dilemma for them. And this probably requires another whole seminar, which is, it's much like in the United States as well with the Democratic Party. We can think of other places. When you face a party which is championing a very aggressive majoritarian nationalism, do you confront it head on, which is what you think you should do to protect minority rights and democratic principles? Or do you try to defeat it where it's weak? So in other words, on the economy, it's handling of the economy, it's questions of governance and so on. And I think the opposition has more or less shied away. When it has won at the state level, it's done so mostly on the economic record of the government. So those are important victories to dislodge the BJP from power. But it leaves unchecked this ideological agenda, so much so that as figures like Suhas Palshikar and others have argued, I think quite persuasively, what the BJP has very successfully done and very disturbing for the future and the present of democracy in India is that it has come to equate nationalism with Hindutva without ever mentioning Hindutva. So many of the tropes and symbols and claims that it's putting forward of what makes India a strong nation, or what it would mean to be patriotic about India, are actually Hindu nationalist claims. But it no longer talks about Hindutva as much as it used to, if you compare it during the reign of Vajpayee, for instance. It now simply talks about nationalism. But it's a nationalism that's imbued with Hindu nationalist ideology and subsumes it. And I think that's what has been so difficult for the opposition at the ideological level, is to understand, how do you counter that? Is a politics of secularism, using that term, adequate or necessary? Is a politics of federalism or championing a sort of a subnational imaginary of the nation, what you need to do to kind of check and confront this aggressive Hindu nationalism? So I think it's these old political challenges of creating parties that have linkages to vibrant movements that can mobilize, a counter politics, and it's been quite shocking to see how the opposition has failed to do this, despite what I think most, I mean, I'm, as you can see, a critic of this government, but I think even a neutral analyst would say that, you know, given the fanfare that accompanied the government when it came to power, if you were a supporter or a neutral observer in 2014, you know, its record on the economy has been really mediocre. And not to mention, of course, simply the division and polarization and violence that has increased in Indian society. So there's so many points, there's so many issues in which the opposition should be able to mobilize something, and it's been unable to. And maybe the final point to say is something I don't think we've studied enough. I know like CSTS surveys have been doing some of this by Lokniti. To what extent have we seen a communalization of belief in Indian society? Some of the surveys that we've seen by Lokniti and the Azim Premji University that they've been carrying out State of the Nation surveys over the last 3-4 years do show a very worrying, disturbing trend to greater support for autocratic behavior, to consolidation of power by the executive, and greater criticism or even opposition to minorities, particularly Muslims, of course, but minorities in India in general. So we may be seeing a change in that. I think what the Modi government has been very successful in doing is redefining the attitudes and boundaries of the demos, of the nation. And that's the most worrying thing. Like you could say in the United States, although I think in the US to a lesser degree, to think back to that very first question, that we're seeing a broader development of these trends in many parts of the world.
Thank you, Sanjay. On that note, we will conclude this webinar. Thank you for a stimulating talk. And I think we need to get you back here to talk a little bit more about some of the issues that we didn't touch upon. I would also like to thank Shirley and Heather for providing fantastic support for a smooth conduct of this session. As a final point, I want to draw your attention to our next webinar, which will be on Thursday, the 12th November at 11 a.m. Scarcity, Abundance, and the Human Dimensions, Analyzing Urban-Rural Water Conflict in India. This webinar will be by Dr. Bharat Punjabi. So you can register for this webinar soon after this webinar. And thank you once again to everybody for joining this session. Thank you.
Yes, thanks to everyone, especially for your questions. And thank you, Sharada.